Welcome back. It is a readaptation of Max Roach's We Still Insist, whose themes related to the civil rights movement. That's a film project and live performance by multidisciplinary contemporary artist and activist Kudzanai Chiurai and drama and composer Tumi Mogorosi. Mogorosi and the Freedom Now Suite Band will be reimagining the album through a performance, and that performance will be accompanied by an audio and visual installation by Chiurai. Chiurai joins us now via Zoom to tell us more about We Still Insist, taking place at the Constitution Hill Museum on the 22nd of September. Kudzanai, very good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to...
By all means.
Yeah, sure.
By all means, it's an absolute pleasure. Now, for someone who may not know about this project, give us a brief background into the origins of Max Roach's We Still Insist and what it stood for.
Well, it's an interesting album because it responds to legislated racism, and the songs and the soundtracks from the album kind of responds and speaks about legislated racism. And for me, I found it really interesting because even the title of the album, We Insist, is still a question that still has to be posed. And that's where, like, this particular project, essentially, We Still Insist, then kind of emerges. So the film and the music are a response to each other and also a question that continually has to be answered. Like, We Still Insist,
yes,
which is the project that'll be at Con Hill, and then the album itself is We Insist. So these two, I think, this conversation happening between the audio and the visual, I think, is essential. It's an essential question or dialogue that still has to happen. And for it to happen at Con Hill, where legislative racism comes to an end, is really interesting for us.
Interesting that you raised that point. So what's your interpretation of that work and, you know, the kind of emotions and the thoughts that it invoked in you?
Well, it's like from the song Freedom Day and Rider Man, it's important to also, for example, the question to freedom and what does freedom mean? What's our responsibility to freedom? What's our responsibility to other people's freedom? Those are still important questions that we still have to challenge ourselves, have conversations about. And those are still, though the music was made like a couple of years ago, sorry, several years ago, the conversation still persists. And what are those freedoms that we recognize? What are those freedoms that I think we share? What are those freedoms that are in dispute? So these are also really interesting to always be in dialogue with.
So, Kudzanai, what kind of themes or even subjects does your audio and visual installation seek to highlight? And why are these worth shining the spotlight on?
So the film is in several chapters. So one of the chapters is Capitalist Manifesto. One of the other chapters is The White Dilemma. The other chapters are conflict resolution, the Black Mother, Black Gold, because I think all of these chapters create, I think, a sequence of events that also explore the colonial history of Southern Africa. And these narratives are also kind of present within the music of Max Roach and A.P. Lincoln and the Freedom Now Suite. And so these conversations are essentially like, the chapters essentially kind of, you're able to move through these ideas in a sequential way. And the music kind of supports and builds these emotions and builds this dialogue, like chapter 4, which is the White Dilemma in the film, and then the other chapters that proceed deal with an essential part of Southern Africa's and white supremacy, and then we also then have to have the conversation post-independence. What is the post-colony? What is that freedom? How do we recognize those freedoms? What are the shared freedoms through this kind of political history?
Sure.
So that's essentially what this film kind of then explores throughout each chapter.
Oh, got you. And how much do we reshape what was shaped by our colonial history? Where do we even start?
That's a difficult question, because if you can kind of consider it's like, well, racism was legislated, white supremacy was legislated for so many years. And then it ends with the signing of a document and a negotiated process. Because one has experienced legislated racism for so long, it doesn't necessarily end at that moment when that document is signed. That those experiences continue to live with so many people. And those institutions that legislated that racism, in some cases, still perpetuate that process. So how then do you deal with it? It's very difficult to say, because yes, I think post-independence, your rights are recognized, your sense of dignity is recognized, but then I think sometimes the paper's not necessarily enough. There should be, I think, far broader process to understand the history of kind of like the colonial violence. So it's very difficult to say what should be like the process.
Okay.
I don't know personally. I don't know who does know, but I mean, I'm sure like other people do know. But
yeah.
On my part, it's really difficult to say.
And how then do you think the Freedom Now suite will interpret, will still insist through music?
I think it's one way of exploring these ideas. It's not like it is the most final understanding of such an idea or such a like colonial history. I think it's one way of doing it. I think this exchange between a sonic experience and a visual experience kind of merging into one is really interesting. I think it's not the exact interpretation of the Max Roach and A.B. Lincoln album. I think it's an adaptation or an experience of it from a different perspective, I guess. So for me, I think that's what it will be. It's not an exact reproduction of the album or an exact adaptation.
Okay.
I think it's an interpretation that relates to the audiovisual experience. I think that's what's significant.
And what sort of lessons came with working on this particular project, and what did it teach you about your own craft?
I think it teaches me like you never stop learning. I think for me that's what's really interesting, because like it's not the first kind of live performance I've had with music or with a group of musicians. I think it's like each experience is very different. I think context of that kind of presentation or that kind of projection is always very different. So there are interesting things to learn about music also in that process. So for me, it's like, yeah, like every experience of it, every installation of it is really interesting. I think there's always something new to learn. And that I really enjoy.
All right, unfortunately, due to load shedding, your bandwidth is very, very low. Thank you so much for making that effort to join us this morning, Kudzanai.
All right, no, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you. That was multidisciplinary contemporary artist and activist Kudzanai Chiurai speaking to us about his film project and live performance titled We Still Insist. It takes place at the Constitution Hill Museum on the 22nd of September 2022 alongside the Freedom Now suite.